The Life and Adventures of James P. Beckwourth. Chapter 4. On our arrival at the upper camp, related in the preceding chapter, we found the men, 26 in number, reduced to short rations, in weakly condition and in a discouraged state of mind. They had been expecting the arrival of a large company with abundant supplies, and when we rejoined them without any provisions, they were greatly disappointed. General Ashley exerted himself to infuse fresh courage into their disconsolate breasts, well knowing himself, however, that unless we could find game, the chances were hard against us. We remained in camp for 3 or 4 days until we were well refreshed, and then deliberated upon our next proceeding. Knowing there must be a game farther ahead, by the river, we moved forward. Our allowance was half a pint of flour a day per man, which we made into a kind of gruel. If we happened to kill a duck or goose, it was shared as fairly as possible. I recalled to mind the incidents of our Pawnee expedition. The third evening we made a halt for a few days. We had seen no game worth a charge of powder during our whole march, and our rations were confined to the half pint of flour per day. We numbered 34 men, all told, and a duller encampment, I suppose, was never witnessed. No jokes, no fireside stories, no fun. Each man rose in the morning with the gloom of the preceding night filling his mind. We built our fires and partook of our scanty repast without saying a word. At last our general gave orders for the best hunters to sally out and try their fortune. I seized my rifle and issued from the camp alone, feeling so reduced in strength that my mind involuntarily reverted to the extremity I had been reduced to with Harris. About 300 yards from the camp I saw 2 teal ducks. I levelled my rifle and handsomely decapitated one. This was a temptation to my constancy, and appetite and conscientiousness had long strives as to the disposal of the booty. I reflected that it would be but an inconsiderable trifle in my mess of 4 hungry men, while to roast and eat him myself would give me strength to hunt for more. A strong inward feeling remonstrated against such an invasion of the rights of my starving messmates. But if, fortifying myself, I gained ability to procure something more substantial than a teal duck, my dereliction would be sufficiently atoned, and my overruling appetite, at the time, satisfied. Had I admitted my messmates to the argument, they might possibly have carried it adversely, but I received the conclusion as valid. So, roasting him without ceremony in the bushes, I devoured the duck alone, and felt greatly invigorated with the meal. Passing up the stream, I pushed forward to fulfill my obligation. At the distance of about a mile from the camp, I came across a narrow deer trail through some rushes, and directly across the trail, with only the centre of his body visible, his 2 extremities being hidden behind the rushes. Not more than 50 yards distant, I saw a fine, large buck standing. I did not wait for a nearer shot. I fired and broke his back. I dispatched him by drawing my knife across his throat, and having partially dressed him, hung him on a tree close by. Proceeding onward, I met a large white wolf. Attracted probably by the scent of the deer, I shot him, and depriving him of his meal, devoted him for the repast to the camp. Before I returned, I succeeded in killing 3 good-sized elk, which, added to the former, afforded a pretty good display of meat. I then returned near enough to the camp to signal to them to come to my assistance. They had heard the reports of my rifle, and knowing that I would not waste ammunition, had been expecting to see me return with game. All who were able turned out to my summons, and when they saw the booty awaiting them, their faces were irradiated with joy. Each man shouldered his load, but there was not one capable of carrying the weight of 40 pounds. The game being all brought into camp, the fame of Jim Beckwourth was celebrated by all tongues. Amid all this gratulation, I could not separate my thoughts from the duck which had supplied my clandestine meal in the bushes. I suffered them to appease their hunger with the proceeds of my toil before I ventured to tell my comrades of the offence I had been guilty of. All justified my conduct, declaring my conclusions obvious. As it turned out, my proceeding was right enough, but if I had failed to meet with any game, I had been guilty of an offence which would ever after have haunted me. At this present time I never kill a duck on my ranch, and there are thousands of teal duck here, but I think of my feast in the bushes while my companions were famishing in the camp. Since that time I have never refused to share my last shilling, my last biscuit, or my only blanket with a friend, and I think the recollection of that temptation in the wilderness will ever serve as a lesson to more constancy in the future. The day following we started forward up the river, and after progressing some 4 or 5 miles, came in sight of Plenty Deer. The general ordered a halt, and directed all the hunters out as before. We sallied out in different directions, our general, who was a good hunter, forming one of the number. At a short distance from the camp I discovered a large buck, passing slowly between myself and the camp, at about pistol-shot distance. As I happened to be standing against a tree, he had not seen me. I fired. The ball passed through his body and whizzed past the camp. Leaving him, I encountered a second deer within 3/4 of a mile. I shot him and hung him on a limb. Encouraged with my success, I climbed a tree to get a fairer view of the ground. Looking around from my elevated position, I perceived some large, dark-coloured animal grazing on the side of a hill, some 1.5 miles distant. I was determined to have a shot at him, whatever he might be. I knew meat was in demand, and that fellow, well stored, was worth more than 1,000 teal ducks. I therefore approached, with the greatest precaution, to within fair rifle-shot distance, scrutinizing him very closely, and still unable to make out what he was. I could see no horns, and if he was a bear, I thought him an enormous one. I took sight at him over my faithful rifle, which had never failed me, and then set it down to contemplate the huge animal still farther. Finally, I resolved to let fly. Taking good aim, I pulled the trigger, the rifle cracked, and I then made a rapid retreat towards the camp. After running about 200 yards, and hearing nothing in the movement behind me, I ventured to look around, and to my great joy I saw the animal had fallen. Continuing my course on to the camp, I encountered the general, who, perceiving blood on my hands, addressed me. "Have you shot anything, Jim?" I replied, "Yes, sir." "What have you shot?" "2 deer and something else," I answered. "And what is that something else?" he inquired. "I do not know, sir." "What did he look like?" the general interrogated. "Had he horns?" "I saw no horns, sir." "What colour was the animal?" "You can see him, general," I replied, "by climbing yonder tree." The general ascended the tree accordingly, and looking through his spyglass, which he always carried, he exclaimed, "A buffalo, by heavens!" And coming nimbly down the tree, he gave orders for us to take a couple of horses, and go and dress the buffalo and bring him to camp. I suggested that 2 horses could not carry the load. 6 were therefore dispatched, and they all came back well packed with his remains. There was great rejoicing throughout the camp at such bountiful provision, and all fears of starvation were removed, at least for the present. 2 deer were also brought in, besides a fine one killed by the general. And ducks and geese and such like were freely added by the other hunters, who had taken a wider circuit. It appears strange that, although I had travelled hundreds of miles in the buffalo country, this one was the first I had ever seen. The conviction weighing upon my mind that it was a huge bear I was approaching had so excited me that, although within fair gunshot, I actually could not see his horns. The general and my companions had many a hearty laugh at my expense, he often expressing wonder that my keen eye could not, when close to the animal, perceive the horns, while he could see them plainly nearly 2 miles distant. A severe storm setting in about this time, had not been for our excellent store of provisions, we should most probably have perished of starvation. There was no game to be procured, and our horses were beginning to die for want of nourishment. We remained in this camp not until our provisions were all expended, and our only resource was the flesh of the horses which died of starvation and exposure to the storm. It was not such nutritious food as our fat buffalo and venison, but in our present circumstances it relished tolerably well. Were General Ashley now living, he would recollect the hardships and delights we experienced in this expedition. When the storm was expended, we moved up the river, hoping to fall in with the game. We unfortunately found but little on our course. When we had advanced some 20 miles, we halted. Our position looked threatening. It was midwinter, and everything around us bore a gloomy aspect. We were without provisions, and we saw no means of obtaining any. At this crisis, 6 or 7 Indians of the Pawnee Loop band came into our camp. Knowing them to be friendly, we were overjoyed to see them. They informed our interpreter that the village was only 4 miles distant, which at once accounted for the absence of game. They invited us to their lodges, where they could supply us with everything that we needed. But on our representing to them our scarcity of horses and the quantity of peltry we had no means of packing, they immediately started off to their village, our interpreter accompanying them in quest of horses, and speedily returned with a sufficient number. Packing our effects, we accompanied them to the village. 2 Axe, of whom I have previously made mention, and a Spaniard named Antoine Behele, chief of the band, forming part of our escort. Arrived at their village, which we found well provided with everything we needed, the Indians gave us a hospitable reception, and spread a feast which, as they had promised, made all our hearts glad. Our horses, too, were well cared for, and soon assumed a more rotund appearance. We purchased for our future use beans, pumpkins, corn, cured meat, besides some beaver skins, giving them in exchange a variety of manufactured goods used in the Indian trade, of which we had a great plenty. We replaced our lost horses by purchasing others in their stead, and now, everything being ready for departure, our general intimated to 2 Axe his wish to get on. 2 Axe objected. "My men are about to surround the buffalo," he said. "If you go now, you will frighten them. You must stay 4 days more, then you may go." His word was law, so we stayed accordingly. Within 4 days appointed, they made the surround and killed 1,400 buffaloes. The tongues were counted by General Ashley himself, and thus I can guarantee the truth of the assertion. To the reader unacquainted with the Indian mode of taking these animals, a concise description may not be uninteresting. There were probably engaged in this hunt from 1,000 or 2,000 Indians, some mounted and some on foot. They encompass a large space where the buffaloes are contained, and, closing in around them on all points, form a complete circle. Their circle, at first enclosed, may measure perhaps 6 miles in diameter, with an irregular circumference determined by the movements of the herd. When the surround is formed, the hunters radiate from the main body to the right and left until the ring is formed. The chief then gives the order to charge, which is communicated along the ring with the speed of lightning. Every man then rushes to the centre, and the work of destruction is begun. The unhappy victims, finding themselves hemmed in on every side, run this way and that in their mad efforts to escape. Finding all the chance of escape impossible, and seeing their slaughtered fellows drop dead at their feet, they bellow with affright, and in the confusion that whelms them, lose all power of resistance. The slaughter generally lasts 2 or 3 hours, and seldom many get clear of the weapons of their assailants. The field over, the surround presents the appearance of one vast slaughterhouse. He who had been most successful in the work of devastation is celebrated as a hero, and receives the highest honours from their fair sex, while he who has been so unfortunate as to not kill a buffalo is jeered and ridiculed by the whole band. Flaying, dressing, and preserving the meat next engages their attention, and affords them full employment for several weeks. The surround accomplished, we received permission from 2 acts to take up our line of march. Accordingly, we started along the river, and had only proceeded 5 miles from the village when we found that the Platte forked. Taking the South Fork, we journeyed on some 6 miles, when we encamped. So we continued every day, making slow progress, some days not advancing more than 4 or 5 miles, until we had left the Pawnee villages 300 miles in our rear. We found plenty of buffalo along our route until we approached the Rocky Mountains, when the buffalo, as well as all other game, became scarce, and we had to resort to the beans and corn supplied us by the Pawnees.